Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education.
Hello, Michael.
Matt, how's it going?
It's good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Doing really well.
Good.
So
good
today,
to be back for another episode.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. Today is all about leadership. So
Yes.
we're gonna have a great conversation with a educational leadership thought leader. Lots of leaders in that statement. And so I was wondering, what is your favorite leadership book or resource?
Yeah. I'm going to admit that I actually don't read a lot of books about leadership. I don't know why that is, but I can think of some that I haven't liked. I do read, like when I come across an article or a headline that intrigues me about leadership, that tends to be what I read. But anyway, the one I'm going to go with is actually a book that you recommended to me called that's the opposite. Chess, Not Checkers. And the author's name is escaping me, but you can look it up. It's not one of the Cathy family, but he had worked for Chick-fil-A for a while. A lot of great advice. It's kind of set in a fictional mentorship. One of the many things that you take away from it is just that leadership is a game of planning ahead, and being not just a visionary, but thinking through the steps. Whereas checkers is a game of reaction. There's a move, and then you have a very limited set of options. Chess is a game about planning ahead. And so there's a lot of great advice in it. I highly recommend it. It's a short book. And interestingly enough, when I picked up the book, I thought this is going to make a lot more sense if I actually learned to play chess. So I learned to play chess. And now I play chess all the time on the chess.com app, which is also
that's cool.
A great skill to have. So there you go. What about you?
Yeah. Speaking of chess, my 7-year-old has gotten really into chess. And during COVID,
nice.
We've actually she's been taking like online chess lessons. And she's really
great.
enjoying it. I think chess is all of a sudden really popular because of that Netflix show, The Queen's Gambit, which we don't let her watch, right? She's 7, but I don't know. We're all into chess right now.
Yeah.
So I love leadership books. And I just finished, last year, a doctoral program in leadership. So I've got a pretty large stack and a lot of opinions. I think last year I actually wrote an article about leadership texts, generally talking about how, there's a lot of really great stuff out there, but I feel like there's two genres, and we don't really discuss the fact that there's like leadership fiction that still has value, but then leadership, like research-based frameworks for leadership that are maybe more grounded in data. And so I think both of those are great, but you have kind of a research-based ones. And then you have kind of the Simon Sinek sort of like pop leadership books, all of which have their own value. But I actually have two of my favorite ones with me. One is a research-based one, and one is a pop fiction leadership book. So
Nice.
The sort of data-driven one, it's called Reframing Organizations by Bowman and Deal. And what I really like about it is that the whole idea behind their framework is that there are these different lenses that we can put on to view an organization from different perspectives that maybe we're not accustomed to typically seeing an organization through. So it really challenges people to sort of problematize their perspectives. And I've found it really helpful when I feel like something makes total sense to me or that something makes no sense to me. Trying on the different lenses, like that's a red flag to me that I should be thinking about something from some other perspectives.
Gotcha.
And then the pop sort of fictional genre book, and I say that not to dismiss its value when I say pop fictional, but non really research based book is called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle, and it's amazing. Really, really great. Absolutely love it. But it's not, it's not research based, but it's a phenomenal text as well. Yeah. And it talks about, it's basically a study kind of like a Malcolm Gladwell type book. But it's, he goes into sort of a journalistic study of some major organizations and what's worked for them and what hasn't. And it's, I think, an incredible book. So I recommend that.
Yeah.
And then my article that I wrote last year about leadership texts being a fictional genre now.
Sure.
That.
Yeah.
I'll throw that in the show notes.
Please do. Yeah, that's great. I don't think I've read that. That'd be good to know. All right. Our guest today is Dean J. Fusto. Dean is a 2020 recipient of the Klingenstein Fellowship at Teachers College, Columbia University, and the president and head of Brandon Hall School, an international boarding and day school serving students in grades 6 through 12. His career spans nearly 3 decades as an educational leader. He founded the TeachLearnLead.net community in 2014 as a tribute to his heroes and heroines, teachers. This comprehensive site is an online edu library that has grown in reach and built a global audience of teachers and school leaders seeking professional development and access to the latest educational research. Dean is a past recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship and an E.E. Ford Fellowship. As a thought leader and influencer, he has published 5 books, dozens of articles, and holds an MAT from the SIT Graduate Institute, an MA from Columbia University, and Proactive Leadership Certification from Cornell University. In 2017, out of his passion for inspiring youth leadership, he founded the Center for Global Youth Leadership and Social Entrepreneurial Studies at Brandon Hall School. In 2020, he established the Therese A. Fusto microgrants to fund social and community impact projects. Let's hear from Dean all about leadership and his latest article.
Hi, Dean. We are so excited that you're on our show today. It's going to be great. And just thank you for being here today.
I'm probably more excited than you are. And thank you for welcoming me and having me.
It is our pleasure. So, Dean, our listeners are new and aspiring independent school leaders. And we like to ask our guests how their educational journey has looked and how they've ended up in leadership positions. Could you share just a little bit about your unique journey?
Sure. I really appreciate the use of the word journey because I think it accurately describes a voyage, kind of a speed of travel and a process of change, hopefully maturation over time. So when I think about that question, I'm actually less focused on listing things I've done or accomplished and maybe more honed in on transformational moments or experiences that led to either a shift or a redirection in my career. So I hope that's okay if I do that.
That sounds fantastic.
So basically, as an overview of school life and the kinds of work I've done, I'll start with some of that, but then I'll talk about 1 or 2 of those journey-specific moments. And any story about me and my journey begins with a nod to my parents, humble, entrepreneurial people without any means to attend college, but who really modeled what it meant to have dreams and work incredibly hard at a craft they loved. And in their case, it was 40 years of owning a restaurant in my hometown of St. Augustine, Florida. And that really was a training ground for me, a setting, where I learned about serving others, getting my hands dirty, creating a product that's either going to be devoured with delight or sent back to the kitchen with disgust. And luckily, there was a lot more delight or they probably wouldn't have lasted 40 years. I also knew at a pretty young age that their life, I'm the baby of 3, was not going to be my life. And, any expectation of taking over the restaurant, that didn't matter to them. They wanted what was best for me. So I knew I wanted to either go into the Peace Corps or teach, and teaching won out. And honestly, I've never looked back. 30 plus years now. Been really fortunate to work in amazing schools with mentors along the way that saw a spark in me and did everything they could to ignite it further. I've been a language teacher, a curriculum director, a camp counselor, international programs director, upper school head, assistant head of school, and then most recently, head of school and president at Brandon Hall. And we're an international boarding and day school serving grades 6 through 12 in Atlanta. So I love my work, the people I work with, and the family and the students I serve. As I mentioned earlier, I know in your program links, listeners can look at my bio and publications. But if it's okay, as promised, I'd really like to share one of those transformational experiences in this journey for me as a first-year teacher. So is that okay, guys?
Absolutely.
Great. Then my first position out of grad school was in a public school. And I was coming into the post with a deep love and training, mostly in experiential ed. So very idealistic and inspired. So the first kind of task I had was getting my head around that I would have 6 classes, 30 students per class. And how could I marry that ideal that I had about teaching with those kinds of numbers? But the moment of transformation for me was when I met Dr. Litke, Dennis Litke, and one simple action he took that honestly, it changed me forever. And it set me on a trajectory of a life in leadership. He believed in a practice called co-journaling, and basically it's where I would record my thoughts and experiences and feelings as a first-year teacher. And every Friday, like clockwork, I submit my journal to him. And then on Monday, he would return it with comments, some prodding, and just some simple inspiration. So I actually, from 30 years ago, pulled my green book. And this is just an example of one little thing he wrote. And basically what precipitated this was I was having a tough week. I took a couple sick days, again, first-year teacher. And I was talking about like succumbing to just the struggle of trying to figure things out. And basically, this is all he said. Again, it's nothing necessarily profound, but he said, Dean, it's fun to read your journal. It's so very deep, creative, struggling, high, low, questioning. You don't ever have to succumb to anything. Your job is to inspire, empower, and support. So just that alone, at least for me, knowing I had a leader who was modeling that, who cared enough to have that kind of connection with me, one of so many teachers he had, it just changed everything for me. And it's been something that's made me want to do the same for others. Just really powerful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's an incredible story. I'm curious, has that impacted the way that you have interacted with young teachers yourself? Have you used the co-journaling practice with other folks?
I think I've done it more in a verbal way or in sharing it now, email and so many links and articles. So it's probably come more through that than in a co-journaling way. But that was certainly his method back then. And it was life-changing and career-changing for me.
That's amazing. It sounds like a really powerful practice.
I love that you still have that book too, because I know exactly how you feel. I mean, we all, or at least I hope we all have those artifacts that we keep from our first years in teaching, especially one like that that's so meaningful. And I think it's worth hitting on again. The 3 words were inspire, empower, and support, as opposed to succumb. Because I know, man, I bet succumb is a word that every first-year teacher can relate to.
Yeah, I remember that year distinctly, and I probably took every sick day that was available to me, because again, I had such high expectations of what I wanted to be as a teacher and how I wanted to inspire. And coming up against just so many students in a classroom setting, it was rough. But people are there to help you learn and get through it. And if you stick with it, great things happen.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's dive into leadership. I'd love for you to tell us how you would describe yourself as a leader. And in our exchanges kind of prior to this, you talked about a fantastic concept, which is your purpose as a leader. Break that down for us.
Boy, leadership is it's so vast and, for me, multi-layered, multimodal, any kind of multi you want to throw in there as a practice. It's tough to really hone it down, but so these questions sometimes throw me. But at the core for me, leadership is about serving others, coaching, guiding, inspiring. The caveat, though, now 30 years into it, is that I've come to figure out that I need to work with others and seek those same things from others to be able to really lead effectively. So it's about being the quarterback, but also the receiver, being selfless and at times selfish. And that might surprise some listeners. I don't know, but I think that I mean selfish in every good sense of that word, that I need to feed from others, feed on their inspiration. So there's kind of two components for me that I'll share with you, models. One is, do either one of you know about John Maxwell's cycle of success? Has that ever come up in any of your readings or your podcasts? So it's a circular cycle as opposed to a pyramid where you go from low to high, right? This is just this repetitive thing. And Maxwell talks about leadership starting with a test and then moving to either kind of a fail. He only talks about a fail moment. I kind of changed that to a fail or succeed moment. And then going to learn, improve, re-enter, and repeat. So it's this round cycle that keeps going. That I know there was a certain point in my career, luckily younger than I think it comes to some folks, but I lost that fear of failing. And I do think that's made all the difference for me as a leader. So that's one piece. The other is around kind of the concept of intention setting. And intentions can change, but for the most part, for me, I start every morning and they're pretty constant. And I have these written down in a journal, but also just kind of go into the day thinking them. So there's joy, inspiration, and purpose. And this gets back to that idea of the quarterback and receiver, selfless and selfish. But the goal for me, and I don't say this is aspirational, I don't say I ever achieve this necessarily, but I try to find ways to provide that joy in my work and inspiration for others. But I also look for ways to get them, to breathe them in from others that I work with. And that purpose piece is what really allows, it's kind of that base, it's the foundation for me even having that intention of the joy and inspiration. So I hope that makes sense. But I think the key part for me is there's a lot of talk about intention setting, but it sometimes is more outward. And for me, I think of it as both. There's a reciprocity, a symbiosis to it.
Gotcha. Yeah, joy and inspiration are something you give and receive. And then purpose, again, you said that's kind of the bedrock of it. Oh, that's good advice. We'll kind of explore that a little bit more as we talk through an article that you recently wrote for Southeast Education Network, or SEEN, called The 5 Pillars of Impactful Leadership. It's a fantastic article. We'll link it in the show notes, and hopefully all of our listeners will read it. One of the things that struck me as I was reading it was how you do a great job of being both 30,000 feet and there's a scene at the beginning where you're picking up sticks in the driveway of the school, because that's what you need to do as a leader. And I love that. It's both granular, practical, and aspirational, I would say too. So we'll kind of get into each of the 5 pillars, but could you give us an overview and what sort of led you to write?
Sure. Well, I think you nailed it. There is for me that constant relationship between the philosophical, the mental models that I'm going to talk more about later, and then the true practical rubber meets the road moments, So as far back as I can remember, I've loved writing. I've been a writer. You just, had me, I gave an example, pulling that journal out from 30 years. There's lots more of those on my shelf. And I think this particular piece, I really wanted to try to process COVID-19 and the pandemic and everything else that was happening in our world all at once in practical ways that could be helpful to others. So the 5 pillars kind of emerged as really tangible components that definitely helped guide me through this time that we're still living in, and also allowed me to help lead my team. So that really was the purpose of that article, and that's what I tried to capture.
Well, we're going to jump right in with the first pillar, which you wrote was people. So in your article, you say that a leader hires team members who are selfless, committed, and ready to run towards any challenge. So my question for you is, how do we find those people? How do you find those people? And how do you know that you're hiring a person of that caliber when you're hiring them? What's your process?
Right. Well, it starts with abandoning the ideal of the perfect person or the perfect candidate. Having been through head searches myself and just knowing how much is entailed and how long they can go on, all the different constituencies you meet, you can easily find yourself as a candidate. So I have a lot of empathy here to present yourself in such a way that you begin to lose who you are. Things get distorted. So I come into any kind of interview knowing that, first of all, that someone who's applying for a position may have that kind of motivation, that they have to show that they're flawless, right? So I am drawn to those folks who understand that imperfection is an asset, especially when it's paired with a desire to learn and an aspiration to lead. And I think those things are pieces that you could extract from great conversations with candidates who, move on to a certain kind of level in the process. But secondly, for me, especially at Brandon Hall, hiring is a team effort, and the leadership team is part of the process, really from start to finish, in different capacities. Particularly when we're hiring a administrator or someone who's going to be a leadership team member. And by that, I mean the other leadership team folks have an ability to provide feedback on something as detailed as a job description, especially in how their role might interface with the person we're hiring. And then in terms of finding these kind of committed or selfless people that you had asked about, that part, there's no question for me that there is something more instinctual about that. And no resume can tell you that. It is a process of vetting and presenting a candidate with case studies, scenarios, vignettes. Those types of things can reveal a lot about a person's character. And I'll also just say that I think it's okay to be somewhat unconventional in an interview, to try to throw someone off what they're expecting to happen. I think that's important. A lot is revealed in that moment too, how someone can think on their feet. So how do you capture that when you're trying to make that hire?
That's fantastic. I'd love to probe you a little bit further on two things that you just mentioned. One is that you mentioned that hiring for you is a community thing, that you involve multiple constituencies. And I love that. I see a lot of schools do that, where they have, a candidate interviewing for 30 minutes with this group, 30 minutes for this group, and so on. And I think there's a lot of value in that. But the real value is in how you debrief an experience like that to make sure that, all of those different people seeing the candidate, somehow all of that information and experience is then digested. What does the other side of all of those interviews look for you? What's an effective way for a team to debrief an interview where so many people from the community have been involved?
Actually going through this process now, and to be able to tell you about the debrief, let me just say one more thing about the pre-brief. We try to look at, there's 3 or 4 of us involved right now in a hire, and we have a number of resumes that we're looking at, and we have told each other, we need to look at these independently. Let's go home over the weekend. Let's have a template we're using and come back to the process as objectively as possible without each other knowing which way we're leaning, no hints, nothing like that. So that part is really critical, I think. And the post piece, I think that's accomplished in a lot of ways. One would be not only bringing the hiring team together to debrief and have a conversation in the moment, but I do think something sometimes is lost in a team setting, because I think it's easy to go into groupthink. I think it's easy to have some voices kind of quieter than others, and that influences what direction you might go. So I think a writing component is really important. So after that interview that you described and that post brief, give people a chance to reflect and write and share thoughts that way, and then maybe bring in the group part. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. And I love how, maybe I'm totally painting you with a brush that might not be accurate. I've only known you for a few minutes, but I love how writing seems to be so core to who you are in your process. That's fantastic. A second thing you mentioned that stood out to me was the use of case studies to throw, in a good way, to throw people off their feet during an interview. And, there's a lot of sort of new research being done in that area. I know the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education is developing, I guess in conjunction with the medical school, scenarios and simulations, right? So in medicine, this has been happening for a long time. You present people with simulations, and they have to respond and think through things. And now that's becoming a pretty impactful thing for education. What kinds of case studies? How have you utilized case studies in interviews? What does that look like for you in a school setting? Yeah,
so here's another great example of where I spoke about something from my past, that first year of teaching, how I came from a very experiential model, which was built so much on that case study idea. So for this particular instance, I would say I keep a file and a folder, and I've done this for a long time. Every time there's some kind of a challenging moment, or not every time, but often when there's a challenging moment, or I'm facing something, it can be anything. Literally, I have a little template, and I create a case about it. The date, I give it some cute little title, catchy title. I write up, this is what I was presented with today, or my team was presented with. And here are some potential ways we can work through it. So I have a collection of these, and it's really just based totally and rooted and anchored in reality, in practice. There's no shortage of them. Does that
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic practice for any leader or aspiring leader to start building their list of experiences now that could be, written as case studies. And I'd love to live in a world where educators, for fun, share case studies with each other. Like, this happened to me. What would you do? Right? Like, that would be fantastic.
Our senior leadership team, we meet every week, and we don't necessarily do a case study every week, but there is a section on our agenda where you can write up a case study, or just, in my case, I'll throw one up there and just put a title and make people think, what is he going to present about? Because again, I like the catchy titles and acronyms and things like that. So it is part of it's become increasingly more part of our, not just a hiring process, but our leadership practice, the way we engage with each other in our team.
If you haven't already written on your website about that would be a great article. I mean, just about that whole process. That's fantastic.
I'm writing that down. Thanks.
Yeah, I for one, I'm going to steal that. And I also feel silly, because I think that most of the times I share case studies are like when a bunch of teachers go out after a conference session or something, and we're all joking about stuff. I could probably have done a more noble thing with them.
But do you see how almost everything in life that we encounter, right? It can be its own case, its own exemplar, right? So it's
that carries over to other fields too. I mean, certainly in my line of work, it not with students, when working with other constituencies, case studies still can be very valuable. So I want to ask you a question about the people pillar, and then we'll move into process, but they kind of connect. So, you mentioned hiring people with these skills, but to a certain extent, would you say you're also building a culture of selflessness and people who are committed to running towards challenges. How do you go about that with people that you've already hired? How do you keep encouraging those qualities?
I think if you're in a school for a long enough period of time, so this is year 5 for me, and it's certainly been true of some other places I've worked, especially when you're at the leadership level, if you're modeling it enough, those like-minded people are going to be the ones that either gravitate towards you or feed off you or feed you. And if that becomes the priority and the expectation, the folks that don't necessarily feel that way or want to work in that type of a culture, they tend to move on. And hopefully what remains is that core group of folks who either wholeheartedly believe it or at least want to work on it, want to work toward it. Because a lot of these things we're talking about tonight, again, they're aspirational. They're not necessarily these perfect things that are happening in a school setting or any organization. But I'd rather have these things to aspire towards than not.
Yeah. Well, and in the same vein as cultivation with your team, your next pillar is process. And in the article, you detail a very clear decision-making process. But you're also, sort of a metacognitive aspect to it. You are thinking about how you're going to make a decision prior to doing it. Is that something you also cultivate amongst your leadership team? Or is it something that's just you do personally, and then you take that process to the team?
It definitely starts personally, but it exudes. It can't help but. So let me give you an example. In my office, I have a really large whiteboard, sandwich board style, and I bought some magnetic, the little magnetic signs you can put on these boards. I probably bought like 30 of them. And I use those, and on every single one of them, I have written a mental model. So you might see something like Covey's stimulus response, Maxwell's cycle of success, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whatever it is. They're all over. So people will walk in and say, what are those things? Or students might come in and say that. And that for me is modeling the idea that for any decision we have to make, there's more than one way to look at it. And it's easy just to say that, but this is a visual that shows it. You can take any decision and put it through a sifter of 10 different models. So there's never really, to me, an excuse or a reason why a problem or a challenge can't be solved. It doesn't mean there's the perfect solution, but there's a model for everything. You can impose these thought processes on anything. So I definitely, I try to I do that personally. That same board that I talk about in my office, I have replicated in my journal on the opening page. I just have it all laid out. So when I'm struggling with something or thinking through something, I'll go to that and I'll say, what if I use De Bono's 6 hats? What if I apply Covey here? And again, it's powerful. When you use it, when you really put it into practice, it's powerful.
That's incredible. I would love to see a picture of that board and all the frameworks you have on it.
Absolutely.
That sounds like a really amazing thing for students to come in and see, especially if they ask you about it. Great conversations. And then I'm sure that has an impact on your leadership team as well.
And I'm sure both of you, just from the podcast alone and your lives and probably so many of the things you read, there's just so many amazing ideas out there, right? Well, we maybe hold on to them for a little while, but we're human and they kind of escape us. So for me, that visual is a daily, minute by minute reminder that these are all things I can lean on or go to. And again, I keep using the word powerful. For me, it is. It absolutely is. And to be able to, as you say, if a student walks in with an issue or something, to be able to point to that board, or my own daughter, point to that board and say, hey, have you thought about it this way, through this lens, through this frame? Good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So the third pillar is plans. And so you talk about in your article COOP and CAPP, COOP and CAP. And I'm curious if you could talk about what are those and what role do they play in school planning after COVID?
They certainly were born out of COVID for me, and I think they are going to continue to play a role, but I'll just briefly touch on what they are. So COOP, I don't know the origins of it. I know that I met someone, I think in the Foreign Service, who talked about COOP. And I said, well, what is that? What are you talking about? They said, oh, that's a continuum of operations framework. And it helps you create really clear action steps across all parts of an organization's operations. So when we were hit with COVID-19 back in March and having to make some really big decisions, there was nothing tangible to grasp at. We were all trying to figure out, where's our guidance going to come from? We're all kind of in the same boat. No one really had anything at that time very helpful to model after. So COOP, what it allowed us to do is, all right, let's take every part of the school, advancement, boarding in our case, day students, and let's create a list of things that have to happen. So COOP is very much, for me, day-to-day, tangible, in the midst of a kind of a crisis moment, right? Whereas CAP, that stands for, in my mind, contingency and preparedness plans. And that's more scenarios. Okay, so that the one is that day-to-day, right, in praxis, and one is, well, what if this? What if that? And what do we do in these situations? So the beauty of both of these, you asked post-COVID, is COOP and CAP have become what is now our Health and Safety Committee. And the leadership team at Brandon Hall has done just an amazing job of meeting weekly, daily if needed, to talk through all kinds of scenarios, to put together action steps. It's a very collaborative process. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please push me and ask for some more clarity there.
No, I think that was a good description of it. When you're thinking about contingencies, so I love thinking about contingency planning, and I can fall into the trap sometimes of maybe over planning, right? We actually talked to someone on this podcast who, prior to the the pandemic, they had been in a business continuity summit at their school where they had just talked about what would we do if there was a pandemic. And at the time, she was mentioning it seemed silly, throwing out all these worst case scenarios, like there's not going to be a pandemic, but what would we do? But how do you in your mind draw the line between over planning and throwing out ideas that are just crazy, but then also not planning enough and not being prepared for those really impactful situations that could arise? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely think there can be some peril in overthinking anything, right? I'm grateful in some ways with the COVID-19 issues that came about. What it really taught me is that it's great to know you can have a COOP and a CAP. You can create one, you get your team together. We've had that experience, but it's not needed for every single thing that happens in a school setting. It was needed at the time, and it's something we could always draw upon. That skill set is there now. It's been deeply lived, every single minute of it. But yeah, there's a danger in taking something like that and wanting to apply it to every single thing that happens in a setting in an organization. So I'm definitely wary of that.
And so just to clarify, let me see if I've got this right. So CAP would in general ask the question, what do we do if XYZ happens? And
Correct.
Coop asked the question, how do we keep going after XYZ happens? Do I have that
Absolutely.
right? Okay.
Absolutely. To me, another way of looking at it would be Coop in a lot of ways is an in the moment. Let's get through this. And let's make sure we have every component of the school covered in that. How do we get through it? Cap is a little bit further off and playing through all kinds of scenarios, which then can lead to some great action steps, right? And some maybe things you never use, but that is the distinction.
Okay.
That kind of reminds me of the difference between a trauma room and an ICU, right? Like, how do we get somebody stable? How do we get all the vital signs there? And then we can get them to an intensive care unit, right?
That's a good point. Yeah. And then even from the intensive care, what are all the things this person needs to do to get healthy and stay healthy?
Yeah.
Right. So.
Great. All right. Next pillar is principles. You write that leaders carry certain foundational principles that don't change. And if I'm understanding you right, those are to a certain extent unique to each individual leader. But other principles evolve over time and develop. So what are those for you? What are some examples of principles that you've gained in your journey?
I think one that I spoke of earlier that I could reconnect with is the principle of setting an intention or intentions.
Okay.
And an example that was when I was spoke about joy, inspiration, and purpose, right? An example of how it evolved was, I'd say earlier in my career, it's, the high energy, dynamic, give joy, give inspiration. That evolved to the principle of find ways to receive it, to walk through the hallways and seek it out. So that is one example of an evolution, an expansion of a principle. Another really bedrock one for me, and it's actually what led to the founding of the Center for Global Youth Leadership back in 2017 at Brandon Hall. It's a core belief that youth and our students, when taken seriously, when given these possibilities, have a capacity to contribute powerful ideas in solving any challenge or any dilemma. And that can be in the school, community-wide, nationally, or even globally. Absolutely believe that. It doesn't mean that every single idea, is a great one. That's part of the beauty of it. A student can come with a proposal or an idea, and I think it's our job to push back and teach them that. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Or going back to those mental models, have you tried this? That's again, just beautiful stuff that we can do with kids in a teaching and learning setting. So that's another core principle. And an example of one, when you talk about evolution, that actually led to the creation of a center at Brandon Hall.
Yeah. All right. So we're sitting here in February of 2021. We've hopefully had a chance to breathe after the year that was 2020. With all the difficulties, and particularly at a boarding school, a unique set of difficulties during 2020, how has it altered your concept of leadership, or what did you gain or develop any leadership principles during last year?
On the one level, I think in talking, if you look for something really, really practical, I think the coop and the cap would be an example of.
Oh yeah, okay.
Of something. But I think another one for me, more philosophical, is every leader during COVID-19 had a choice, and that choice was to step out of the fray, or to lean into the messiness and the uncertainty of it. And I definitely, just in my own network of heads, I've seen both. I've seen lots of heads just say, no more. I gotta move on, change a career.
Oh, wow.
And then I've also seen heads galvanize and forget about the competition between schools and were on weekly, sometimes daily Zoom calls with each other. And that was really powerful. So I think too often something like that, this idea of step out of the fray or lean into it, these things can be dismissed as platitudes or cliche. But I've always felt that platitudes and cliches exist for a reason. They're battle tested. They are truisms. And C19 definitely, it taught me that idea of the choice we have every day, and that whole notion of within crisis there's opportunity.
Sounds like you had a good network to lean on too. Tell us about the significance that your network of heads played.
Yeah, definitely the local level, the Atlanta heads of school. There were great Zooms that were happening pretty regularly. Still remember Monday at 3:00, I think it was, we would get on and just be able to talk through some of the things we were facing and share. And then at the national level, NAIS and SIS did great work. And then at the boarding school level, TABS, they continue to offer webinars and chances just for heads to gather and talk. That was not happening at the degree it is now. The question is, will it be enduring post COVID-19, that camaraderie and that need, or will it settle and go back to maybe, we just get so wrapped up in our own work, there's not enough time to do those things. You have to kind of seek it out on an individual basis. That's going to be interesting to watch. And I don't know the result yet.
Yeah. Is your Atlanta network through AAAIS, or is it something you've just formed together? Yeah, that's a good organization.
Yeah, and there are some others that have formed together, just kind of organically as well. But yeah, that's 4 examples of networks.
Yeah. For those who lean in and continue to stay connected, I wonder if we'll be able to see a measurable impact over 3 to 5 years for those who stay in constant communication and trying to build each other up. It sounds like a powerful thing.
It is. And there's another thing, another silver lining that I think some schools have kind of figured out or discovered in this. And it definitely has happened for us at Brandon Hall. But through COVID-19, we've established partnerships that probably may not have happened before. These are win-win partnerships with organizations that have now become either part of Brandon Hall or I think of Atlanta Workshop Players. They've been in the area for a long time. Great theater, film, TV production with kids. They've moved their entire center onto the Brandon Hall campus. So now we have a model that's pretty rare. I mean, a lot of schools have their own kind of internal arts departments and things. But this is a whole organization that's come, and now we're linked, we're connected, and who knows what's possible. That was not probable in a non-COVID-19 environment. It just, the circumstances wouldn't have allowed that to happen or made that happen. So really interesting to me. And I think that's probably, there's pockets of schools where that's happening in other capacities too.
All right. So we are to the 5th pillar, payoffs. So the question is, how do you carve out time for celebration and reflection, the celebration and reflection that you need to keep growing? And then how do you provide that for your team?
Well, I do think reflection is everything. It's omnipotent, because to me, if you're a reflective person, everything leads to it and everything extends from it. And what I mean by that is, the very need to reflect, something brought you to have that desire, right? To want to write about something, whether it's those case studies we talked about earlier, or just reflecting on your day. And then typically, at least for me, from that moment or that practice of reflecting, there's always some action or thought or idea that comes from it. So that's, again, another just powerful concept that I feel like I try to live out every day. I keep a journal, and that's absolutely critical to me. And in it, I make space for tracking and monitoring things like my fitness, right? Pomodoro sessions. Those are I don't know if you're familiar with those, but those are 20 or 30 minutes where you just hear you set a timer and it's just click, click, click. And while you're doing that, you're focused on one thing, kind of along the line, a little bit like Cal Newport's work on deep work, but a shorter version of that. So I record things like that, how I use my time. And then using reflection and my own journaling is just a launch pad for ideas. And it's okay to have a graveyard of ideas too, of failed ideas. I'm fine with that. I can go back and look at some of those things and either laugh about them or exhume something, from that graveyard and bring it back to life. Because maybe there's actually something good about it that's wasn't relevant then, but it's relevant now. So on the team level, I think, we talked earlier about the leadership team and meeting weekly and the case studies we use. That's also a time where we can bring any issues to the forefront that we're facing, or just for sharing information or taking some quiet time to reflect in the moment. There are times we'll put a document up on the screen and say, we need feedback from everybody on this. We've given we've given some time for you to read it outside of the meeting. Now let's take 10 minutes, total silence in the meeting. And here's a collaborative Google Doc. Everyone's just typing away, asking questions. Again, things that maybe they wouldn't do in a group setting that was primarily based on verbal feedback, where people feel a little bit more freed up when it's written. So that's a real tangible thing we just did a couple of weeks ago, exercise. It blew me away to see all the comments coming fast and frenzied,
So, Dean, that's the last question that we had officially wanted to ask you, other than our closing questions. But I'm curious because I mean, obviously, you are a wealth of knowledge here, and I'm learning a lot. What question should we have asked you that we didn't?
Oh boy, those are always tough.
Well, and you don't have to answer, but I'm just curious if there's something that we really should have asked you, but didn't know to ask.
Yeah, I think when I was talking a little bit more about purpose, maybe drilling that down a little bit and asking about, if I could even have answered it, where that even came from, that idea of a purpose, or in other settings it might be called a calling, or it just depends. Maybe a little bit more exploring on that topic would have pressed me a little bit to think along those lines, because I love reflecting on that piece too, purpose and the why. Right, Simon Sinek's work on that. Again, just great ideas and thoughts.
Okay, so Dean, when we talk about purpose in leadership, because this is something I've done a fair amount of reading on and asked a lot of friends about, just to get, first of all, clarity between, and I want to ask this of you, what do you see as a difference between purpose, vocation, and calling, or is there a distinction?
I think for me, earlier on in my life, and it could have been the upbringing, my family, Italian family, right? I probably thought of calling more in a spiritual context, right?
Sure.
And now, for me, in more of a career mindset, or even things I write about, or even talking about with you on this podcast, when I said earlier that at some point in my career, I kind of lost that fear of failure. Mm-hmm. I only lost that because I had a purpose. Like, no one can take away. Once you have that is so core. For me, I don't worry about, as I said, either an idea that might fail or even losing my job, because you can't take the purpose away from someone. Does that make sense?
It does. It sounds like, and I guess I say this in the context of someone who's, maybe younger or developing in their career, but purpose would even transcend ability.
Sure.
Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I think it also would make you want to take your ability and have it rise to the level of your purpose, right?
Yeah. So when you, to tie it to what you were saying with failure, if you know your purpose, when you fail, you see that not so much as a failure, but as proverbially the opportunity to learn, as the chance to, you're just going to come right back to that purpose.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Then, and this will get into a little bit of spiritually, but do you define those things as individualistic, or are there things that are holistic? Are there purposes that we all share, or purposes that all educators share? Or is it something that we are looking for unique to ourselves?
I think the moment where the individualistic aligns with the organizational or the mission, you found it. You found that work for life right there. So that's one way I would answer that question. And even before, when you're talking about vocation and calling and purpose, I do think all of those are kind of interlinked.
Sure.
And that's probably a subject for a whole other episode, right?
Yeah. Everybody and different beliefs, belief systems may define those differently, but they're definitely cross-connected.
Sure.
Yeah. And purpose, I guess I should say too, let me ask you this. I think I know the answer to it, but I'll be curious to see what you say. Of those three, purpose, vocation, and calling, are they all lifetime things? Or do they are some shorter than others? Is it possible to have multiple purposes? It's possible to have multiple callings.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely met people who fall into those kind of categories. And I think, again, purpose could potentially change or evolve or morph into something different over time. But I still think back beginning of my career to now, that's something that just hasn't shifted much. That belief in what I was saying earlier about, the setting of intentions, right? That joy, the inspiration, the belief that all youth have something to bring to the table.
Yeah.
That the language around it may have changed, some of the practices, the way it's taught, but the core pieces that's been intact for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
So,
I love that all youth have something to bring to the table. I know different teachers would define that differently and sure. See it in different ways, but to a certain extent, I think when you've lost that feeling, or if you don't share that notion of optimism in youth, you should look elsewhere. It might be time for you to move to a different place, or to at least recharge and come back.
We're in agreement on both of those for sure.
Yeah. Well, we end our podcast by asking the same three questions, and they are: what should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And how can people connect with you? But I'm going to interrupt that a little bit, because I think we need to talk about Teach, Learn, Lead, which is definitely something everybody should be reading, or at the very least, they're going to find the next thing they should be reading. So tell us about Teach, Learn, Lead.
Yeah. Back in 2014, again, the notion I was an upper school head at the time at a school in New England, and I wanted to be able to share articles and things that I curated with. It gets back to that inspiration piece with my faculty, right? So I was doing maybe a weekly little newsletter where I'd put links to articles and send it off, and I just got to thinking, okay, there's an appetite for this. I surely am never sated. There's never enough when it comes to wanting to learn and to curate great articles. So it began individually with my own need for that, a one kind of place to go and be able to click on things and learn. Then it became a sharing out within a school community. And then I said, I would love to even take this further and see if there's a network of teachers and leaders out there that would also want to benefit from this, would want a place where they can go and find great resources. So the concept of Teach, Learn, Lead was to create an edu library. And here again, there's that selfless and selfish component, because a lot of it was about, I want to have an oasis where I can go to and find, here's my categories, and I can go to anything. So when you go to my site, there's not necessarily a lot of bells and whistles on my site, but it's very clearly buckets, right, of information and collections.
Yeah.
And when I took that concept and then married it to LinkedIn and some of the social media and Twitter and started sending it out, what I learned was the followership of it went way up. It just grew exponentially, and all kinds of great connections were made. So that site now is 7 years old, kind of relaunched it with a new look. But it just continues to be a place where I just will add more and more content for people. It's free and always will be. It's just there for anyone who wants it, who wants that inspiration. And send me a note to add other links. You know, your podcast is an example of that. We recently added it to the podcast collection.
Yes. Thank you for doing that. And just to, for those of you who haven't gone to it, I mean, I'm just looking at the podcast page, and it's well over 50 podcasts. I mean, I would almost define the site as an index of resources. I mean, it is a treasure trove.
Yes.
I actually just found one I've been looking for a while, a good nonprofit resource author that I love. It is definitely on my bookmarks bar and should be on all of our bookmarks bar. It's a great site. Very easy to navigate to.
Thanks.
So kudos on that. All right. So what should people be reading, or what are you reading right now?
Yeah, I totally admit that I am an author's worst nightmare, because I keep books around me all the time. I guess it's good that I'm buying their books, but I'm not a start and finish kind of guy.
Yeah.
Right. I'm constantly pulling ideas from books and moving from topic to topic. So I think the head of schoolwork maybe created that mindset in me, because the role of a head is just so all encompassing. So right now I'm working through Essentialism by Greg McKeown, Perennial Seller by Ryan Holiday, 25 Strategies of War by Robert Greene, and The Miracle Morning by Hal Elrod. All these books are vastly different. So I'm getting the marketing, the minimalism, the health and fitness kind of morning ritual, and the strategy piece. And I just love taking snippets from all of them, you know, and those snippets then create a whole picture. One other practice from what I'm describing that I'm doing, it's a kind of project I'm doing for my daughter, but also something I want to keep doing for myself, is as I get some wonderful or read some wonderful passage or hear something on a podcast or somewhere, I like to dedicate a page in these journals for each of those ideas and pass it on, in this case, you know, to my daughter. So she will have these ideas at her fingertips whenever she wants them throughout her life. You know, that's a great exercise too, I think, to do with kids as I'm talking this through, to help them build that resource, right? That whiteboard of 30 ideas I talked about, but in a different setting. Excellent advice. What should people be listening to? Well, obviously your podcast, right?
Thank you.
But I'm definitely a podcast sponge. And two of my favorite go-tos are Ryan Hawk's Learning Leader and Joan Gary's Nonprofits Are Messy. I really enjoy those. Find them really helpful and in depth. And then for a shorter kind of contrast to that, Sean Croxton does something called the Quote of the Day Show. And he always, every day, will take an excerpt from some thinker who's doing a lecture or a YouTube piece. And it's always something very different, but very inspirational. So there's that something that's giving me the inspiration that I talked about earlier. Listening, though, also means music. So I have dozens of playlists. All are very genre specific. I love shuffling, but I also like when a song leads me to discover some other artist or other song. Yeah. Right. And then I think the other kind of listening that probably is the most important of all, and I do fail at this, unfortunately, time and time again, in terms of making it a daily experience. But the Brandon Hall campus is on 24 acres. It's absolutely beautiful. They're forested on the Chattahoochee River. And just being able to take some time to sit alone and just take in those sounds, the water, the wind, the wildlife, it's a wow factor, but I don't do it enough. And I gotta get better at that.
I love it. I love it. Well, how can people connect with you?
Well, kind of as one of those core kind of beliefs around connection being so important, I think always a direct email is great. And LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on there, curating, sharing posts, sharing articles. And then Twitter, at DJFTLL. That's my initials and my website. So Dean John Fusto, Teach, Learn, Lead, DJFTLL. And then, of course, through my website, there's a place you could sign up and get updates. I don't have much time to do updates with my other work, but the beauty of Teach, Learn, Lead is that it informs directly everything I do in the school setting, right? It's all about education and leadership. But those are just some of the ways that people can reach out. And if they're in the Atlanta area, I always love showing off our campus and meeting great folks, always having the expectation of meeting that next person on the journey that we talked about earlier.
Well, Dean, this has been a great conversation. Thank you again for joining us. This is one I think we'll come back to from time to time. The listeners will have a lot to glean from it. I know we will as well. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and spending some time with us.
I so appreciate that you both had me on the show, and I will I promise I'll be a regular listener, and I'll be promoting your work because you're doing great work.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.